So as an aging biologist, my day-to-day business and running a longevity startup, I'm usually working on deep proteomics aging profiling, so dealing with thousands of proteins expressions. But I'm a bit unusual in the geroscience crowd, having a philosophical background as well, when I learned a lot of analytical philosophy and model logics and mathematics. So when I'm pondering about the big state of the geroscience field, I'm encountering some problems. Sometimes I'm using ideas from philosophy and sometimes from mathematics. And this is how I came up with this little recursion idea, and trying to answer like two different problems. So one problem regarding the state of the geroscience field that I stumbled upon was that fact one is that there's no consensus definition about what biological aging consists of. And when you look into the papers of the biggest scientists in the field, it's just like apples and oranges and idiosyncratic pet definitions that everybody comes up with by their own account. And that might tell you, first of all, that these biological folks are not really number one formal definition makers, and sometimes it doesn't really matter, but from a different point of view, it would be nice to have something that looks like a consensus definition. Because the fact number two, that since 2013, we have a consensus view emerging about biological aging, which is like probably the most famous figure, these 9 hallmarks of aging processes that was defined. And this is where the conversation usually starts. So when I was, the other problem I was thinking a lot, it did research about what biological aging is, that what I describe as aging versus aging, so singular versus plural, how you grab the complexity of this problem. And usually in science, there's one way to go ahead is reductionism, when eventually you try to simplify the main principles, come up with like one singular notion of explaining things. And that worked out well most of the time. Think about how the DNA structure resolution suggested how it functions with the coding problem. But in aging, sometimes it can be particularly misleading, I believe, to come up with just one single principle. On the other hand, there's holism, which basically says to you kind of an overcomplified picture that biological aging, in order to understand it, you need to understand the whole of biology, all 20,000 genes, all 100,000 transcripts, all 1 million proteoform variants that are being actually expressed at one thing at a time. And I was wondering whether there's a space in between, some moderate pluralism that can give you a view. And when I tried to translate the hallmark view into a toy definition myself, ignore the rest of these list, just focus on the first two. So I came up with this phrase of biological aging is agings underneath, the result of multiple, separate, diverse, interconnected, but malleable hallmark processes. And what we need to focus on here is this term of biological aging is agings underneath. This resolution when I'm actually defining aging with an aging process itself, by itself, and that's the recursive step. And recursion is something, a fundamental mathematical idea. A very important one is a class of iteration, inductive definition recursion that worked out pretty well in math and in physics and in many other places in biology itself. When you define a set with a member of its class, or a member of a set other members. So define yourself with a different part of yourself. And one example is the Fibonacci sequence, the recurrence relation when the upcoming member of the sequence is defined as a sum of the two previous members. And you need to initialize this sequence with base cases that can have multiple ones like 0 and 1. And this way you can come up with nice non-circular recursive definition in mathematics for sure. And when I was looking into the hallmarks view suggestions of how to structure the 9 hallmark processes, and they suggested, which is like half-baked one in many ways, but still there was a structure there in case there's some primary hallmarks like somatic mutations, proteome maintenance going haywire, telomere attrition. And these base cases sort of as sufficient themselves to trigger biological aging, to cause it, what we talk about, and then can lead up to as Lego building blocks to the other more complicated hallmarks like antagonistic hallmarks, integrative hallmarks. And this to me suggested a structure. So we're focusing on a content, the form of a recursive definition here, behind a hallmarks view, not the actual content. So solving problem number one is that it's very, very flexible. It's correct. It's flexible because we can merge any hallmarks back, or if the list is not exhaustive, come up with new ones. And in terms of how it solves the other problem, the riddle of aging versus aging, complexity, avoiding oversimplification and overcomplication, is that aging is aging. So we turning a singular into a moderately plural list. And that was my thinking as a philosopher. And then when I went back to as a scientist to my aging problem. Thanks a lot.